Hello, beautiful people. It's Ms. Burns coming at you. I'm recording this on a Saturday. It's pretty rainy out today. Hope you guys are all keeping healthy. I heard it really works well, actually. Listening to world history videos. Yeah, if you did not know this, I know people said, like, oh, exercise, build up your immune system, maybe make sure you got your vitamins going on. But I actually heard in order to fight this coronavirus, watching history videos, doing history work, actually they said like what it does to your brain, really fighting the virus real well. So I mean, I don't got the research on me right now to prove this and back it up, but I'm just saying, who knows, right? I'm gonna cover our bases here. That's why I'm so healthy right now. I'm doing great. So just sharing a little bit with you. What we're going to do is we're going to review today Japan and the Mongols, which that's what you're going to focus on this upcoming week. And that's what your quiz at the end of this week is going to be on. It's going to be about the Mongols and about Japan. So maybe you read this on your own when I gave you guys PowerPoint and I had you guys focusing on really the Tang and Song dynasties. But Japan I wanted to keep separate because I didn't want to overwhelm you guys. And Japan is a different story, right? So when we look at other places who had contact with China, like Korea and Vietnam, right? Korea and Vietnam were tributary states to China. Japan, however, has a different story, where because of Japan's geography, right, they're not connected to the mainland of Asia, right? They are a chain of islands, and there's water that separates. And because of that distinct little feature, although Japan's very close to China, they were able to adopt some things of Chinese culture, but at the same time, the Chinese weren't able to exert their control of Japan. So that's really the most significant difference between Japan versus what happens with Korea and Vietnam. So what things did the Japanese take from Chinese culture? We see the influence of Buddhism and Confucianism, right? When you guys did the Knights and Samurai DBQ last week, right? Big influencers there as far as philosophies into even samurai culture, right? Was Buddhism and Confucianism. Chinese, as far as their bureaucracy, their court rituals, how they went about the courts, like their calendar, different ways government created a organized and efficient society, right? Their way of taxes, some of their law codes, and some similar ways in their writing system. Is it exactly the same? No. But the idea that they use symbols, like how China uses symbols, by drawing and using different, using lines, that's how we could say the Japanese did take from Chinese culture. But this is voluntary, okay? That's why, and I'll come back to this later on, but this idea of selective borrowing. So like borrowing, basically the idea that you're selecting, you're choosing what elements of a culture you want to adopt or borrow and bring into your own culture. So, early Japan was based on clans. This also came up in the DBQ. Basically, these families are kind of controlled. So that's why when we go to compare Japan and medieval Europe, there's a lot of similarities, right? You had in medieval Europe these manors, right? And the manors would fight with other manors, right? That's why we call it feudalism, right? The word feud or fighting is there. Very similar to the warlords in Japan and these family clans that would compete for power. Now, there's another philosophy that was not discussed yet, and this philosophy is called Shintoism. Shintoism pulls off of other Asian philosophies, especially Taoism, where there's this deep connection with nature, this belief in spirits. It's polytheistic, definitely, compared to things like animism maybe you would find in Africa, right? But this idea that things have a spirit. If you know Swarakami there, I don't know, those of us are familiar with World War II. In World War II, when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, they called them kamikaze pilots. right? So think about these pilots who were supposed to inherit this spirit or this wind when they flew their planes and crashed into Pearl Harbor, right? So this idea of kamikaze, it comes from that word, which is one of their belief systems. But even just the idea of ancestor worship, right? I mean, that's something we talked about when we talked about China. So we see these common things with themes within Asian civilizations. So when we look at Japanese culture, all right, a lot of the artistic achievements came out of this period known as the Heian period. So it influenced a lot of art, literature, what you guys could be doing for your discussion board, the rengas, the poems, right? So utilizing different styles of poetry, such as rengas, that are pretty minimalistic. But there were larger tales as well, such as the tale of Genji. But some people felt like it distracted people, right? People are so focused on the arts that they weren't worrying about things that need to be taken care of, right? Like efficient tax collection and the things that they adopted from China's government, but weren't keeping tabs on in their own, right? So when we look at Japanese architecture, what we call like pagodas, so we see these roofs, right? And these roofs have like these little wingtips, right? And they're also like, there's several levels sometimes of these little roofs. So that's very, very characteristic of Japanese architecture during this time period. But again, it wasn't originally their own, right? If you were to look at this slide, the bottom left here, this is a Chinese pagoda, right? And then right on the top left, you have the Japanese one, right? So you could see right away how they pull from one another. Over here, what you have is writing. So you have Chinese writing, and then you have Korean writing, and then you had Japanese writing, right? So we could see the similarities between them. And the landscape painting, right, which is something we definitely see, like especially during the Tang and Song dynasties, right? This emphasis using nature and landscapes, which pulls in the philosophies they believe in. So over time, in the Heian period, the emperor had lost power. What you guys looked at, the feudal pyramid for Japan, right? We know a lot of power resided in the shogun, actually. So this is actually what gives way to feudal Japan. So, comparisons, right? You guys saw this with medieval Europe, so I'm not really going to go over this, right? But many similarities. You had lords, you had this relationships with one another, you had a warrior class, you had a code of honor, whether it be Bushido and samurai or knights having chivalry, and the majority of people being mainly peasants. Right? Now the big difference between knights and samurai is Japanese samurai really don't have a fear of death. Okay, and actually they are willing to even commit suicide. That's something you would never see a knight do because that's a sin in Christianity, right, to commit suicide. But in Japanese culture, suicide is not seen as sinful, right? If you dishonored yourself, right, you lost in battle, you brought dishonor to your family, you're actually expected to commit suicide. So the practice, the ceremony, is if you see here, this gentleman actually has a blade in his hand, and he would shove that blade into his stomach and rip it back and forth. And then you have this guy here who would come down with his samurai sword and chop your head off just to make sure the job was done. Again, connections to World War II. Kamikaze pilots did not see flying their planes into Pearl Harbor, right, and killing themselves. They saw it as an act of honor, right, or a way of bringing honor to their families. And part of the reason why the Japanese were actually so hard to defeat in World War II. Again, you guys aren't expected to know this, but just fun facts here, is that we had ended the war in Europe, but yet we were still fighting the war against the Japanese, okay? So actually it's part of the reason why we dropped atomic bombs on Japan, is because they just would not surrender. And that's, again, part of the culture and philosophy and the belief systems of Japanese people. Now, Japanese women were not as oppressed as Chinese women, so they did enjoy a lot more rights. So that would be a significant difference between Japanese women as opposed to, let's say, women during the Song Dynasty, right, who had their feet bound. And that's just getting into the China stuff. So that's the key ideas there with Japan. And then what you guys will also be reading about this week are the Mongols. So let me try to do a quick review here of the Mongols. Mongols, we've been kind of playing around talking about them, right? We know their roots kind of come from the Xiongnu people. Constantly have been an issue for the Chinese. They are nomadic. They are excellent on horseback, which, you know, you'll read and learn more about their culture in the documents you read this week. But cool things, I think, personally, I mean, they used to ride, you know, they could go so long horseback. That's supposedly a tactic that they would use so they could keep moving, you know, keep on the move, is they would actually be riding their horses, and there's a vein, like at the top, I guess, of like where the horse's neck is, and you could like suck on the blood, and they used to do that because that would give them enough, I guess, nutrients to kind of keep on and not have to stop for like food, or let's say they are low on food or water, they would just like suck the blood of their horses. Women also were considered close to equals in Mongolian society. They had a lot of influence. When the Mongols actually take over China, which they will after the Song Dynasty, they end the practice of foot binding, and women did actually reach positions in government as well. So these are some nomads, and what you see here is very characteristic of the Mongolian people. Place called Mongolia today, right? It's actually like real country today, but the word stems from the word Mongols, but those are yurts. So they're these like round structures that could easily actually be packed up and moved, right? Because that's what the Mongols did. They were nomadic. They moved with the herds. Today, some people still construct yurts. They go camping in them. So they're still used nowadays. This is a rather fancy looking one, but to kind of get the idea, pretty cozy. It seems pretty cozy, at least. Interesting thing about the Mongols and why there's not too much as far as what we say, like, well, where's Mongolian architecture, right? Where are their achievements? The interesting thing about them is their biggest achievement was allowing others to develop their own skills. Okay, so for example, like when the Mongols, I'll show you in a second, when they took over places, they didn't really ever enforce their own religious beliefs. Rather, they kind of assimilated or adopted whatever the belief was of those people there. So it's an interesting type of idea from the Mongols. And there's other stuff too that I'll talk about once we get to the other slides. How they organized themselves. So they were, even though they were nomadic, and I know the Chinese looked at them as barbarians, they actually did have a government structure, what they called steppe diplomacy. So the Mongols weren't necessarily just all one big group always listening to one ruler. Times that happened. But also the Mongols were like these small tribal groups originally. And so what they did was sometimes they allied themselves with other groups that were nearby to kind of strengthen themselves, strengthen numbers. And they were known for being so ruthless for when they defeated people. And I think I told you guys this story in class, but there's a story of how Genghis Khan, which we're going to throw him up here in a second, but he had defeated this one group of people. And supposedly the people who they killed, they took their bodies and they basically laid them down on the ground. And he put basically a throne, right, like a little platform and a throne that he got to sit in like above their dead bodies, right? So that's definitely making a statement. It's definitely showing you're cutthroat and ruthless and you don't want to mess with these people. But once you were conquered, you actually kind of lived life as it was. So it wasn't so terrible. So the Mongolian Empire, actually, if you were to look at like the largest empire ever, um, they are one of the largest empires ever in history. If you were to look at just the amount of land that they covered at one point. So the Mongols did not reach here. Okay, I don't want to confuse it. This is like Turkish peoples, so these people were neighbors to the Mongols. So the Mongols are really focused on Asia, right? Like these, like right here, they were worried about the Mongolian presence, right? Especially if we're looking here, more in the Middle East. Okay, so Temujin is the original name for Genghis Khan. Okay, that's his original name. Legend goes that he was born, and when he came out of his mother's womb, he had like this blood clot or something in his hands, and they thought this was like an omen that, you know, he would be some type of important person one day. But he's the one who actually takes all these little Mongolian tribes, and instead of them making separate alliances through steppe diplomacy, he actually unites them and becomes a universal ruler to all of them. So they conquered China. Okay, they do conquer China. And like China, they did believe in a bit of a meritocracy, right? So like China, the civil service system, the idea if you work hard, you receive higher positions of power. Same thing happens in the civil service exams, right? If you work hard, you do well, right? You could be a poor person, you could work your way up. This is the Mongolian Empire, right? So, I mean, they literally covered all of Russia, China. I mean, it's amazing as far as the amount of land under their control at one point, at their height. So under Genghis Khan, So Genghis Khan is the first guy to establish a Mongolian empire. Kublai Khan is an incredibly important figure too. He's a grandson of Genghis Khan. And when he was ruling China, he ruled under the Yuan dynasty. Okay, the Yuan dynasty. That's what the dynasty was called because that's what China uses, right? During this time is also where we see Marco Polo, right? So we compared Marco Polo to our Islamic Moroccan friend, right, who was a traveler, Ibn Battuta, right? The idea that both of them had these stories of their travels, but there's not a lot of confirmation as to whether or not they traveled themselves. Marco Polo is incredibly important, though. Whether the stories, how truthful they are, the biggest impact it had, if you look at the time period, right, we're going all the way up even to the 1300s, we're at the brink of the Renaissance. So what we're going to see is an increased demand for Asian goods and interest of Europeans because his stories are kind of get people curious about, well, what's this world of China kind of like. So that's very important. But there was a strict separation. So like, for example, during Kublai Khan's rule in China, if you were a Mongolian, you weren't allowed to marry a Chinese person. If you were Chinese, you weren't allowed to study the Mongol language. So they did keep some things separate, probably as a way to maintaining their power. Now, we had brought up the word Pax before, right? Pax, when we talked about Pax Romana in the Roman Empire, Pax means peace. So Pax Mongolica is Mongolian peace, okay? So this really was important along trade routes like the Silk Road. And we would even argue these trade routes thrived at this time, right? This was like really, really a great time for travel and trade and for the prosperity of different civilizations along these trade routes. And because the trade routes were safe to travel, we also see a lot of the spread of religions through missionaries during this time as well. Right, so it's peaceful, people traveling, it's prosperous, there's religious tolerance. What leads to the end of the Mongols? A lot of things were mainly economic, whether it be plague, right? So the plague that happened, which, I mean, hey, we see how this virus is affecting or will affect our economy and the world economy, people's ability to work jobs and sustain growth. Mongols dealt with that as well, okay? Plus, there were some rebellions as a result of a failing economy. People lost their faith in the government, and that's why the Mongols were no longer around in China. Now, if we're to look at the Mongols to the west, they sometimes get this nickname the Golden Horde. That was because of the color of their tents. They reflected like this golden color. Now, the Mongols have a different story in Russia. Okay? In Russia, the Mongols isolated Russians from the rest of Europe. Okay, so in many other places, there was like this blending of cultures. But in Russia, they treated the people well, but they didn't allow Russians to connect with the rest of Western Europe. So this is going to be a big impact, because when Western Europe ends up going through like the Renaissance and they start moving into this new modern era, Russia is always going to be behind, and that's going to shape Russia's history, not even just during this time period in the 1200s, but really for the rest of the course of history. I mean, if you're looking to the 1900s, Russia was so behind. They did not do well in World War One. There's a lot of things. I mean, I'm not going to get too much into it. You'll worry about it in Global too. But just, it's going to severely affect them in not a great way. Okay? And I'm going to stop there. Okay? So that's really where our focus should end with the Mongols. And we'll talk about the Ming another time.